All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the end of this class on the overview of the history of Christianity. As far as I know, I will not be teaching next Wednesday night. I appreciate everyone's attention and time that you've given to this class. I also hope that it's given you access to some of the saints that exist beyond our lifetime. You could connect with Gregory of Nyssa, Thomas Aquinas, or Anselm of Canterbury. But this is not the end of Christian history. Just this month, the Anglican Communion has experienced a schism. This schism will be written about by Anglican historians for centuries. And even if both sides come back into communion again, they'll still talk about it. And because of this schism, Pope Leo recently prayed with King Charles about the schism, which is the first time a pope has prayed with the monarch of England since before Henry VIII, nearly 500 years ago. So, Christian history is still changing and evolving and all the good things. As always, we're going to start with our rules. Rule 1, we're not covering everything. Despite this time period being within a lot of our life period, we're definitely not covering everything. Rule 2 is that history is contested and not settled. And that is all the more true when we are dealing with present time. So this is still very much up for interpretation, and that is why historians like waiting 100 years before they write a book about anything, because it kind of lets the dust settle a little bit and lets tensions calm down. On the note of tensions, this class may ruffle your feathers. It may point you out. It may call you out tonight because, like I said, many of us have been alive through at least part of this period. So you may learn things you didn't know about your own life, and you may not like what you learn. This is your warning. I am simply trying to report what I know. So that comes and brings us to our rule number 3, which we brought up last week. That is that this is all original research. I have gathered stories and sources, much like a reporter, to kind of build these last 2 classes. So you're not going to find a historian's book about what I'm teaching this week. It's not been written yet. You will find books that are tangentially related and confirm many of the facts that I do present. However, the story itself, highly suspect. It has not gone through academic rigors like almost everything else I've presented to you. So if you, from Nazi Germany all the way back, there are peer-reviewed articles, books, journals, all sorts of good stuff that have withstood academic rigor. Since Nazi Germany until the end of this class period, that is just not the case. So take this with even more of a grain of salt than usual. My goal has been, and always is to connect the Christians of the past to the Christians in this room. I think it's really valuable if you understand what you're inheriting. You may like it and lean into it. You may not like it and want to reject it. Either way, it's actually still a part of you. And if you are unwilling to accept that part of you and have grace for that part of you, it's going to be hard to move forward in whichever direction you want to go. So, last week we talked about American history because the texture of Christianity has been realized in the United States since our government elected to endorse Christianity in an effort to fight Soviet communism in the Cold War. That effort began with the Democrat Harry Truman and was solidified under the Republican Dwight Eisenhower. There's a bold little lettering in here, and it says, "And I don't care what it is." So the goal was to get people religious to fight communism. We talked last week about how you had other options out there, but Christianity had the proper infrastructure throughout the United States to accept millions of adherents. Best guess of percentage of the country that was Christian before World War II is somewhere between 32 and 45%. That's a guess, could be higher, could be lower. By 1955, 92% of Americans will be self-identified as Christians. That's a massive explosion of people. Of that 92%, this is of all America during 1960, 63.3% of Christians attended church weekly. So that's a huge number of people all of a sudden becoming religiously minded. And a lot of this was done by our government endorsing preachers like Billy Graham and others. I'm not saying those preachers were wrong or right or otherwise. I'm saying that either overtly and out in the open or underneath the table, our American government was attempting to make us religious as a people. The logical choice was to make us Christian. A lot of that had to do with the idea and the truth that most churches were split evenly between Democrats and Republicans until the 1980s. And that holds true all the way back to the founding of our nation. Yes, are you going to get outliers of 80-20s? Of course, but that was not the norm. You could not count on a Christian voting bloc, and that was seen as a plus to our government's leaders. Now, in the wake of World War II, that meant we had an infusion of theological and philosophical learning by acquiring leading German professors from a divided Germany. Alongside this infusion of professors, we had an infusion of money that led to two overarching initiatives. The one that everyone in the world benefits from is a deeper study of biblical history through archaeology and linguistics, which was fueled by anti-Enlightenment sentiment that the Bible was a book of fairy tales or fables. So archaeology and linguistics work to prove the validity of the Bible and the story of Jesus as rationally correct. And we can see this in something like the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the Great Psalm Scroll 11Q5 and is one of 981 texts that are cumulatively called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have found that I think it is 98% of these texts, which were written somewhere around the 1st century, are exactly what we have today. So that's unheard of for any text outside of the Bible. The Bible is the only book that withstands that level of scrutiny through that type of archaeology and linguistic study. That shows that when we made the printing press back in the 1500s, the people knew what they were doing when they figured out how to understand exactly which word went where and how to translate it. That means those people did a really good job because it has been more or less the same since the printing press was invented, and so they crushed it. Good job, those people. The other great program that went into was a sense of anti-Nazism. And this led to kind of the question of who is oppressed in this world, which led to a bunch of different branches of what we call liberation theology. So immigrant theology, black theology, feminist theology, theology of the poor, Latin American theology, differently abled theology, and gendered theology. All of these studies benefited from and used the archaeology and linguistics that was going on in the other side. And in some cases, the other side used some of these theologians to kind of reach back into time and figure it out. So the issue with this question is people were oppressed in America, and the government more or less wanted to maintain a capitalist status quo. We can see that in someone like Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who, of course, fought hard and spent his life attempting to make the Civil Rights Act a reality. And so, in many ways, I found it helpful to put Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s face onto this slide right here. And so if you go back to the 50s or the 40s or the 30s, is this face treated well? No. So that's where we get the idea of black theology, for an example. Just an easy example. That's right there. He certainly probably did not agree with all the things in here. So don't take that as Dr. King's blanket endorsement or something like that. But his face is really a good one to kind of keep in mind of someone who stood against maybe what the government was probably hoping for out of Christianity becoming the official religion. So our state in the 1950s fused the religion. The question might be was it for religious purposes? And if you read the documents of Truman and Eisenhower and their successors, it was for state purposes. When you have someone like Reverend Dr. King Jr. speak out against the state, what happens is it opens up the state to be co-opted by religion, or for religion to be baptized by the state. And if you have been paying attention in this class, you know which one of those two is more likely. It is more likely that religion is going to be baptized by the state. Both of those moves actually are anti-American, as our founders laid out. And so the left and the right will both attempt to use Christianity over the decades to get their agenda across. This is Billy Graham on your right and President Harry Truman on your left. So the first pastor to be photographed in the Oval Office. So Billy Graham was wildly popular and wildly successful at what he did. Our American government made sure of that. Rode those coattails easy. So the left, throughout the rest of this time from the mid-1960s until present day, will call on Christian compassion and things like that to fund things like AIDS research. During the 1980s, the AIDS was largely stigmatized as an illness impacting the gay community. In the US, the perception shifted with media focus placed on Ryan Wayne White and other prominent heterosexual HIV-infected people such as Magic Johnson, Arthur Ashe, and the Ray brothers. Although these cases were often framed as innocent, a contrast to the gay men who were seen as guilty subjects. The U.S. Congress passed a major piece of AIDS legislation, the Ryan White Care Act, shortly after White's death in 1990, and it was signed into law by George H.W. Bush. So the left, in many ways, used Christian care and compassion to push the nation towards AIDS research. So they were using Christianity to get there. The right, on the other hand, because of using this compassion, will call empathy sin, empathy and equality sin. The roots of this left versus right can be, both of these books were published in the last year. The root of this left versus right, though, can actually be found in the uniquely large affiliation of churches known as the Southern Baptist Convention, or the SBC. Prior to the 1970s, most churches were roughly politically split. There's certainly outliers, but your average church hung where between 45 and 55%. That will change by the end of the 70s and on into the 80s, where you will find churches end up either red or blue. That is more or less what we experienced up until the 2016 election. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. So what is the SBC? It is the largest Protestant denomination in America. It began much more open to ideas and messaging shifts to make sense of local culture. So it kind of hung on to the idea that that Paul held, where be all things to all people. So it doesn't make sense to talk in a Southern accent if you're in New York, is kind of a simple analogy, but that also shows that the cultures around America and around the world are a little bit different, and so the gospel can adapt to those cultures while still holding truth. So that's how the SBC began. And a great example of that is they ordained women pastors until 1984, and they firmly removed women pastors again in 2000. Prior to the year 2000, they had a prior to what we will call the Conservative Resurgence or Takeover, they had a non-literal reading. The opposite of that will be an inerrant reading of the Bible that will be confirmed in the year 2000. So, this famed Southern Baptist unity that has been more functional than theological, Southern Baptists had banded together to incorporate in ministry, missions, and evangelism and education. So long as they emphasize functional ministry, i.e. the rope of sand, as one historian called it, it holds. When they switch from function to doctrine, unity gets threatened. So, economies of scale, let's all get a whole bunch of churches together. We may not agree on everything because you live in California and I live in Florida and they live in the Dakotas. And those are not just different climates and regions of our country. The people there are different. But as long as we all kind of function together, it works out. But if you start getting into the doctrinal statements, which we're about to get into, you will see that we have it. The founders in 1925 wrote, "We have constructed for our basis no creed, acting in this manner upon a Baptist aversion for all creeds but the Bible." So, did anyone notice where that statement is from? It's from the Restoration Movement. So, what we're going to see, particularly in the 1970s, is a move of the Southern Baptist Convention towards a lot of things that are Restoration Movement. Now, they get this idea of creeds divide, but Christians should be able to find agreement by standing on the Bible, not from a theologian, but the rationalism of John Locke, a philosopher. He was reacting to the idea of deism of Edward Herbert, first Baron Herbert of Cherbury, and Locke sought a way to address religious divisions and persecution without abandoning Scripture. To do this, Locke argued against the right of government to enforce religious orthodoxy and turned to the Bible to supply a set of beliefs that all Christians could agree upon. The core teachings of the Bible he viewed as essential were the messiahship of Jesus and Jesus' direct commands. So if you've ever heard command, example, necessary inference, that's from John Locke originally in the 1700s. Christians could be devoutly committed to other Bible teachings, but in Locke's view, these were non-essentials over which Christians should never fight or try to coerce upon each other. So, the idea that the Bible can be only read in one way or one manner, or there's only one reading, is a Locke idea, who was not a trained theologian. Now, the Restoration Movement thinks that's a pretty good idea because they're trying to get back as far as they can. As I said a few weeks ago when we first started talking about the Restoration Movement, they're the first people to go, hey, maybe Augustine and pulling our foundation from Augustine isn't such a great idea. And so they tried to do their best to look beyond it. The question of resurgence or takeover in the SBC that we're about to talk about broadly comes down to how you view Augustine's vision, the city of God. That is, Augustine's vision of how Christianity becomes or interacts with state power, backing, and control. Is the state one with Christianity? And if so, which controls which? Now, let's remind ourselves that each time the state has become intermingled with Christianity, the end game looks something like Nazi Germany. Inquisitions, crusades, you've seen this pattern. The true legacy of much of Western Christianity, unless we today change it, is this bridge that empires drive over to crush people. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche noticed this in his book called The Gay Science, in which he states, God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed them. Predates the Nazis by about 50 years. So, if you read through the top Nazi readings, they just used Christianity. They were all too happy to kill God and leave him dead. But Jesus resurrected, so that's the catch there. So, if you'll remember, I said that the Restoration Church was the first to attempt to get beyond Augustine visions. And so, in large part, it represents an in-between stage of moving beyond Augustine while still maintaining that anti-Enlightenment fundamentalism that is still a holdover from Augustinian and Thomistic logic. So Thomistic, that's St. Thomas Aquinas. Go read his many pages in the Summa. And it is that tension between moving beyond Augustine and conserving what has been Christianity that is going to mount in the SBC conservative rise. We can see this kind of anti-Enlightenment fundamentalism in something like the Scopes monkey trial, which is, of course, famous. Now, that is John T. Scopes, or it's supposed to be John T. Scopes at the top. It is supposed to be Darwin in the middle and Sigmund Freud at the bottom. And that is the slippery slope of modernism. And this came out during the Scopes trial, so I thought that would be helpful. So let's get back to the SBC. Oh, I did not say something. Oh, well, we'll get there again, maybe. So what was the Conservative Resurgence or Takeover? Well, it was a series of orchestrated procedural moves to elect conservative-minded people into the SBC hierarchy and organization. It was largely done by Paul Pressler on your left and Paige Patterson on your right. Paul Pressler was a former state representative and judge in Houston, Texas. Paige Patterson was the president of Criswell College in Dallas. They met in New Orleans in 1976 to plan the successful political strategy to elect like-minded conservative convention presidents and in turn members of SBC boards and throughout the entire SBC organization. And then eventually replace professors in seminary schools so the pastors would think like them too. Paul Pressler, if you have seen anything about him recently, his legacy was stained after he was accused by a former assistant, Gerald Dwayne Rollins Jr., of sexual assault. As part of the lawsuit, at least 7 other men also came forward with their own accusations against Mr. Pressler of sexual abuse. So, if you have heard of the SBC sexual abuse scandals one way or the other and their cover-up, it actually starts right here in the founding because there's significant evidence that Paige Patterson knew about this and covered it up, and that is why he has been removed from a ton of SBC statues, windows, all sorts of stuff. So he's been removed from a lot of stuff because it is very likely he knew all about the sexual assault against these 8 men by Paul Pressler. The rallying cry and what really made this group successful was Roe v. Wade. This is a picture of the Burger Court. It's not the original Burger Court. Warren E. Burger is in the middle there. William Rehnquist is up at the top left. And so that may, more people I think have heard of William Rehnquist if you're younger, like I am. So the Burger Court was the period of history of the Supreme Court from 1969 to 1986, where Warren E. Burger served as Chief Justice. And they were this is the court, not Rehnquist, I believe he wasn't there yet, that decided the thing of Roe v. Wade. So the conservative Christians, Patterson and Pressler, used abortion as a rallying cry. The court will get more conservative from here until today. In some ways, Supreme Court nerds argue that this is the last time the liberals held a majority. So that's interesting because the liberals won't hold a majority by 1980. So if Roe v. Wade is your rallying cry, in 84, the Republicans hold the presidency, Congress, and the Supreme Court. What was not challenged in 84? What was not challenged until 21? Roe v. Wade. So pay attention to what's going on. It's a good issue to rally people around, but not a great issue to solve when you had the chance. And it mostly focused on how voting went. They were political masterminds. Pressler and Patterson, they knew exactly what they were doing. Here is another member, Paul Weyrich, talking about the vote. Let's see if this will work. I will turn this up to see.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly, goes up as the voting populace goes down.
So, if you remove people that you don't want voting, then you can win elections. What group of people just got their voting rights secured 15 years before he made this speech? Black people and women and Latino people, and a lot of people had their voting rights secured in 65. Now, women got the right to vote earlier, but Black women were certainly not voting until 65. Maybe some men. And so it is not just one group, it is all of those groups that we might call oppressed. Now, if you'll also notice that if the pendulum of the oppressed people groups was a swing away from Nazism, this is swinging the pendulum back. So you'll notice, who do they want to not vote? All the people that the Nazis don't like too. So I'm not saying that these people are Nazis. Please don't hear that. But you'll notice similarities. Just like you'll notice similarities between them and the Crusaders and the Inquisition. This is a pattern that we have now seen several times in this class. This face was the one that they were against. So, how did they do it? So, after they got conservative-minded people into the SBC hierarchy, they noticed that the preaching hadn't changed yet. The people were still roughly politically split. They had not organized something like a Christian voting bloc. And so the way they did that was something called statements of faith. So these were a way to, once the leaders of the SBC were elected, they noticed that it did not change the congregations because it did not change the preaching. This was because many of the preachers were trained by high-standing German theologians who were all too happy to disabuse them of any sort of Nazi sympathies. The problem with removing these tenured German-trained professors and preachers was that there was no way to fire them. They were tenured. And they were living by the standards, for most observers, of Christian lives. They were attempting to uphold the ideals such as loving their enemies, be those enemies Vietnamese, Korean, or communist. So remember, why is America Christian in the first place? It is to fight communism. So if Christians start leaning towards communism, that's a disaster for our government. That's going to become important. So how to fire them? The answer is both simple and heartbreaking. Heartbreaking because as a college student, I was unknowingly a part of this system. This system was faith statements, introduced in the mid to late 1970s. Faith statements became a legal workaround to fire tenured professors. They were written into university bylaws that everyone, student, janitor, president, and professor, had to sign. When I went to Lipscomb University, I signed just such a faith statement. And the liberal and well-trained professors could not sign such a statement. They had two reasons. The first one, it was exactly what the Nazis required when they pushed the Aryan Clause. So number one, all these Germans were alive when the Nazis pushed the Aryan Clause and went, that was a terrible thing, we're not doing that again. Again, I'm not saying the SBC or the conservatives are Nazis. The playbook is very similar. Number two, the faith statement contained false language. Now, before I get into, I had a little thing that I had written down about this part right here, and I want to... Okay, now, before I go into false language, and I have an opinion on it, I am trying to report the sentiment of internet friends who were forced to resign or sign, and most of them resigned. So, I'm reporting here. You make your own judgment. Take it, leave it, your decision. So, the false statements revolved around the inerrancy of the Bible. Now, we may not think much of it or we may think a lot of it, but most professors could not sign such a statement because the statement claims something along the lines that the Bible does not disagree with itself in significant ways. The problem is, for these well-trained professors, it did. Again, I'm just reporting this. Take it, leave it. So we can look at something like there's your German-trained professors that are teaching us. So, what is a harmony gospel? Does anyone know what a harmony gospel is?
Four gospels that report things in chronological order. Harmony, reporting the same thing in 4 different gospels.
Okay, say that loud.
So when you have 4 different eyewitness events and they're covering the same story, the wording can be slightly different. And you can say, oh, well, somebody made a mistake, or you could say, these are 4 eyewitness accounts that can be put together into a unified account, which is what the harmonies try to do.
Okay, so they try and put it all into one account, which is interesting because according to many of these professors, you wouldn't need such a thing if they all naturally agreed. The first harmony gospel was written by a man named Tatian in roughly 150 to 170 AD. So we are talking a guy who had original copies of the 4 gospels. He wrote a letter that we have. And in his letter, he explained something to the effect of, I could not stand the contradictions within the 4 gospels, and so I must correct them to properly honor our Savior, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ properly. Now, that meant changing some of the gospels, and Tatian back then stands as having the unique distinction of being universally excommunicated by the church before the church had any sort of council that had ever taken place. So what they would say is you should realize that yes, the gospels have differences, and the gospels yes, the Gospels have differences. And if the Gospels have them and the original speakers and readers of the language working with original copies noticed it, you can bet people have noticed it throughout the centuries. So this is why we will not see anyone claim inerrancy until the year 2000, which we're going to get to. No major group will claim the Bible is inerrant until the year 2000. Now, the exception of that being probably the Restoration movement, but since we are all individual congregations put together, it is hard to classify us as a single entity, organized entity. The SBC will be the first ones to do so in the year 2000. Now, remember, what is the other arm that we've been going into is a deeper study of linguistics and archaeology. So these professors, these German-trained professors probably went, why haven't we ever done something like inerrancy? And they read the languages and the original histories and they went, oh, that's why. I'm not telling you that the Bible is not inerrant. I'm saying that they could not sign faith statements, number one, most importantly, because they knew what was coming for them from the last time a politically minded group tried to push something on them. And number two, it contained false statements in their minds. So I am repeating. So, and again, the idea of inerrancy comes first from, in many ways, the Restoration movement, which of course comes from John Locke, a philosopher, not theologian. So let's talk about the SBC's political leverage. Now, you'll notice I have a whole bunch of red boxes around these. The red boxes are actually intentional because what you will find is that theologically speaking, all of these red boxes agree or are very, very similar in how they think theologically. Obviously, there are differences, such as Churches of Christ generally don't do musical instruments and everyone else does. So there are differences in worship style and things like that. But when it comes to like theology of the Trinity and some of the bigger questions of Christianity, all of these groups in red boxes are very, very similar. Distinguishing, if you brought St. Thomas Aquinas into the present and he read about the Churches of Christ and the Baptists, he'd be like, they're the same thing. Are there differences? Yes. Are they important to us? Yes. But theologically speaking, they're very similar. You'll notice that the other denominations is a half box, and that is because many of the non-denominational churches have Baptist roots. They may not be SBC affiliated anymore, but if you went into a Baptist church and then you went into a non-denominational church, you're going to see many of the same themes and styles and theological beliefs. The other group I had to put a half box around is the Episcopal Church, because the Episcopal Church is Anglican, and Anglicans just split over this issue, over the issues. Half of it now very much aligns with more or less Baptist, Southern Baptist theology. The other half does not. So there's a big difference there, and a stark difference. And there's a reason why those boxes aren't around some of the other things. But you'll notice that that's a big chunk of the Christians. And this is a chart from 24. So that gives you an idea of the breakdown. So when you get the SBC to put in a whole bunch of conservative-minded people in leadership, and then you remove the liberal professors, who mostly end up on the coasts, by the way. That's one of the reasons why the coasts are liberal, that's a chicken and the egg kind of thing. But that one of the reasons is they remove them from the heartland of the country. Liberals were removed, liberal professors. And so what that created, though, was a Christian voting bloc, basically. And so for the first time, there was a large enough group of Christians that came together and became a voting bloc, and the first person to take advantage of that was Ronald Reagan, which I always find to be the greatest of ironies, considering the rhetoric around that comes out of conservative-minded individuals today about how they don't like California. Ronald Reagan was a Californian governor, and they voted for Ronald Reagan over Southern Baptist Jimmy Carter. So when you see a group of people outing their own, the suspicion becomes that there was a deal made or something happened. Or in the case of Reagan, more likely, I didn't like the same people. They both hated communists. They both hated or disliked black people. They both hated a lot of the same groups together. And Reagan capitalized on that and was able to more or less win the Cold War with that kind of political capital. In many ways, Ronald Reagan won the Cold War with that Christian voting bloc. So, not all negative, whether on this conservative rise. Of course, what happened though was the Berlin Wall fell. So, this union between the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan began to dissolve with the fall of the Berlin Wall. Ryan Burge, a Christian statistician and author of Graphs About Religion, go check it out. It's super fun if you like graphs about religion. It's got awesome data. Huge fan. Posits the greatest setback for the SBC in the game of politics was the fall of the Berlin Wall. Why? Because the government's need for Americans to be Christian to fight communism was demolished alongside the wall. Books based on this data will probably come out in a few decades. So we're in the 90s now, folks. That's how close we are to the present day. So, and that put the SBC on the back burner throughout the financial success of the Clinton presidency, only for their loud protest about the Lewinsky scandal and how important it was that the president have the moral high ground. That brings us to SBC 2000. In SBC 2000, there were three things that are major doctrinal shifts in the SBC. Number one, women cannot be ordained. So they have cut off all women being ordained. So in 1984, it was no more women could be ordained. Now in 2000, you're unordained. I guess so much for their statement on priesthood of all believers. And they added this clause for what women's roles would be in the SBC, and it is that she submit herself graciously to the servant leadership of her husband. So that is what women can do in the SBC. The second one will be the Bible and is inerrant. The 1963 version of this Baptist faith message statement stated that the criterion by which the Bible is to be interpreted is Jesus Christ. So they said, we're going to look at Jesus and then interpret the Bible. This phrase was removed and replaced with all scripture is a testimony to Christ, who is himself the focus of divine revelation, over concerns that some were elevating the words of Jesus above other scriptural passages. So instead of going, let's look at Jesus and then interpret the Bible, which is more or less what Paul does, they're going, let's look at the Bible and then interpret Jesus. So Jesus no longer becomes the lens through which the Bible is read. Rather, the Bible is the lens through which Jesus is read. So Paul's words contain equal weight to Jesus's words in this statement, if that makes sense to you all. Again, I'm reporting here. I'm neither agreeing nor disagreeing. I'm trying to remain neutral. The last one was increased doctrinal, not personal, accountability. Not personal because we know about all the scandals that have come out since. The Baptist Faith and Message in 2000 was intended to serve as a clear standard of faith for the convention's entities. Following its adoption, SBC seminaries, mission boards like the International Mission Board, and other institutions increasingly require their faculty and missionaries to affirm that their beliefs and teachings were in agreement with the new confession. So, Faith Statements 2.0 right here. This is what came out of the SBC 2000, and in many ways sets us up for everything that is currently going on in Christianity right now. The next big thing that will come out of the Southern Baptist Convention, positive or negative, will be Donald Trump, President Donald Trump. Ryan Burge, Graphs About Religion, notes that 90% of white evangelicals, so if you saw all those red boxes, more or less white evangelicals. Churches of Christ are obviously a little bit of a mixed bag because we're all unique entities and things like that. And likewise, we should assume that about other churches that are not SBC affirming. So 90% of white evangelicals who attended church multiple times per week supported Trump in 2024. That was a 9-point gain from 2016. Among all white evangelicals, regardless of church attendance frequency, Trump carried 84% in 2024. Trump also won the Christian vote overall. 58% of Catholics voted him and 63% of Protestants, according to early exit polls. So, Trump is a Christian or Christian-backed president. Just is. This is a cool graph that kind of shows you the shift since the year 2000 of Christians to the right. I guess, I don't know, this is y'all, or yeah, no, to the right. And you can see here among mainline Protestants in 2008, that vote was still roughly 50-50, which makes sense if your churches are mostly 50-50. And so the mainline Protestants are not quite as Baptisty as evangelicals are. But you can see that that is slowly shifting in 2024. So until the last election where mainline Protestants, a majority, supported Donald Trump. All right, that was the second bell. So, last thing. Patriot Church. This is Lenoir City. This is a church that has grown out of what is called the Make America Great Again movement. So there are actual churches. There are 2 locations for this, and I think a total of 1,000 members. So this is not a small fringe church. This is a fairly sizable thing. So, in 100 years, I imagine that historians will look back and be like, out of this movement grew these churches that are Make America Great churches that teach both the Constitution interpretations in certain ways and the Bibles, and they overwhelmingly, like 99%, support Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement. So these are churches that are all in on the Republican Party. All of this stems from the conservative rise in the SBC during the 1970s. Whether it's a resurgence and you agree with it, or it's a takeover and you don't agree with it, you will find many liberal professors who were forced to resign call it a takeover. You will find many conservative pastors will call it a resurgence and a return to glory for the SBC. I am not here to tell you which one to take. I am here to report why things are the way they are. Today, I hope from these 13 weeks you're able to understand our current moment and tension in Christendom, and now why so many on the left might call the SBC and Trump's fascists like Nazis, because they perceive a pattern that we've gone over at length. Whether they are or not, I'm not here to make the judgment call. There is a potential pattern. I hope that you can also see the danger that the right perceives by failing to conserve Augustine's vision of Christianity. It would mean reimagining how we do church, like in our heads part, radically change. It would be radically different from the way we think about and approach Christ. Now, we as Churches of Christ are a little bit on the front edge of that if we were to do such a thing, because we have already attempted to do so. Regardless, I hope this class has piqued your curiosity, and I hope you study more. Do not take my word for gospel. I do not have the final say. I have told you a story for 13 weeks in hopes that you would examine the story, find its, I am sure, many faults, and find your way into a great cloud of faithful people. Find the quiet people if you're going to study Christianity and the history, because the quiet people are oftentimes the ones worth learning from, worth emulating. Don't go for the big, loud, bombastic guys. They have problems and issues. Go for the quiet people, the people who live faithful lives and never get a big name for themselves, but people keep quoting over and over again because there was really something there. Those are the people you want to find. Those are that's the cloud of witness you want to enter into. So that gets us to our current moment. If you have questions, come up and ask. If not, you can go get your kids. Thank you all for coming for 13 weeks. It has been a journey through the ages, and you will have a different teacher next week. So